Chapter 1. The Prelude. The story of chemical warfare in World War I begins with the prelude to the horrors that would follow. The early days of the war saw traditional methods of combat dominating the battlefield, but both sides were searching for an advantage. In April 1915, the Germans initiated the use of chlorine gas during the Second Battle of Ypres, shocking the world with this horrifying innovation. As a greenish-yellow cloud rolled across the battlefield, it caused panic among the unprepared Allied forces. This marked the first chapter in the grim tale of chemical warfare, an eerie omen of the horrors to come. Chapter 2. The Race for Deadlier Gases. The use of chlorine gas was a catalyst for both sides to embark on a race to develop even deadlier chemical weapons. Mustard gas, a more insidious and persistent poison, was introduced by the Germans in 1917. This chapter delves into the deadly competition that unfolded as scientists worked tirelessly to discover new and more potent toxic substances. The story of chemical warfare now had a new and even more sinister chapter, where science and warfare became intertwined in a sinister dance. Chapter 3. Defensive Measures. As the specter of chemical attacks loomed, soldiers were outfitted with gas masks and protective gear. This chapter highlights the frantic efforts to develop better protective measures. Soldiers learned to cope with the ever-present fear of chemical attacks, and trenches were stocked with gas masks, decontamination equipment, and protocols for rapid response. The front lines of World War I had turned into a surreal battleground of gas masks and trenches, where the air itself became an enemy. Chapter 4. Trench Warfare and Stalemate. The trenches of World War I were already grim places, but chemical warfare made them even more nightmarish. This chapter delves into the daily horrors and suffering endured by soldiers on the front lines. The introduction of gas attacks added a new dimension to the misery of trench warfare. Soldiers lived in constant fear of gas attacks, knowing that a sudden, silent killer could sweep across the battlefield at any moment. It was a life of perpetual vigilance, where the air was laden with the stench of death. Chapter 5. International Condemnation. As reports of chemical attacks and their devastating effects circulated around the world, international outrage grew. Nations, regardless of their involvement in the conflict, voiced their concern over the inhumane nature of chemical warfare. The story of chemical warfare in World War I is not just about the use of these weapons, but also about the widespread condemnation and efforts to restrict their use. This chapter explores the growing international consensus against the use of these horrific weapons, setting the stage for future disarmament efforts. Chapter 6. Escalation and Retaliation. The cycle of escalation continued as both sides developed increasingly lethal chemical agents. Phosgene gas, deadlier than chlorine, and the infamous lewisite were among the new weapons introduced. This chapter takes a closer look at the ongoing evolution of chemical warfare tactics. It delves into the macabre ingenuity of military scientists who sought to push the boundaries of what chemical warfare could achieve. Each new weapon became more lethal, leaving soldiers and civilians alike in greater dread. Chapter 7. The End of the War and Legacy. With the end of World War I in 1918, the use of chemical weapons diminished. This chapter explores how the armistice and later the Treaty of Versailles imposed restrictions on the use of chemical weapons. The war ended, but the specter of chemical warfare remained, leaving a lasting legacy. The chapter also delves into the immediate aftermath of the war and how the world grappled with the physical and psychological scars left by these weapons. The story of chemical warfare was not over. Its shadow still loomed. Chapter 8. The Ongoing Threat. The story of chemical warfare in World War I didn't end with the war itself. This final chapter touches on how the lessons learned from this dark period in history continue to influence international agreements and efforts to prevent the use of chemical weapons in modern conflicts. It examines the establishment of organizations like the Chemical Weapons Convention and the ongoing struggle to ensure compliance and prevent chemical warfare in the contemporary world. The specter of chemical warfare continues to haunt the international community, reminding us of the horrors of the past and the need to safeguard against its return.